In the spring of 1798, the 5 men who governed France sat in a room and agreed to send Napoleon Bonaparte to Egypt. Not because they wanted Egypt, because they wanted Napoleon out of France. He was 28 years old. He had just come home from Italy, having won a war nobody expected him to win, and he had come home the most famous man in the country, more famous than any of the 5 men signing the order. Crowds filled the streets for him. Soldiers talked about him the way soldiers do not usually talk about generals. He had negotiated a peace treaty with a foreign empire without asking anybody's permission, and then handed it to his own government as a finished fact. 28 years old, and France already belonged to him in every way except the official one. That was the problem with Napoleon Bonaparte, and Egypt was the solution. They could not dismiss him. He was too popular. They could not promote him any further without simply giving him the country. So somebody said, Egypt, 3,000 kilometres away, across a sea controlled by the British Navy. A campaign so ambitious that if it worked, he would be a legend, and if it failed, he would be somebody else's problem permanently. And here is the part that ought to stop you. He knew. He almost certainly knew exactly what they were doing, and he said yes, anyway. 15 months later, on a dark beach outside Alexandria, Napoleon walked away from 40,000 of his own soldiers without telling one of them he was leaving, and sailed home to take the country that had tried to get rid of him. What happened in between is one of the strangest expeditions ever launched by anybody. A war fleet with a library on board. 400 ships crossing a sea swarming with enemies, and not one man aboard except Napoleon himself, knowing where they were sailing to. An army that won its battles, lost its way home in a single night, and then sat down in a foreign country and accidentally opened 3,000 years of human history that the world had completely forgotten how to read, including one broken slab of black stone, dug out of a mud wall by a soldier who was only there because he had been told to repair a fort. If you're here to relax, travel through time, and step into another world, to see what they saw and feel what they felt, you're in the right place. If you enjoy the journey, leave a like, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in Los Angeles might be listening at midnight, someone in Canada on a long drive, and someone else walking by the sea. All of us travelling back through time together. And now, start with a room in Paris. To understand why anybody thought Egypt was a good idea, you have to understand what France was in 1798, which was a country that had spent 9 years pulling itself apart. The revolution had eaten its own leaders. The king was gone. The men who removed the king were gone. The men who removed them were gone. What was left by 1795 was a government called the Directory, 5 directors and 2 legislative councils, which was corrupt, broke, deeply unpopular, and terrified of the army. Terrified of the army for a good reason. It had already survived one attempted overthrow by calling on soldiers to save it. Everybody in that building understood the arithmetic. Whoever the soldiers actually loved could take Paris in a morning, and the soldiers loved a short, thin, badly dressed Corsican with an unpronounceable name and an ability to move an army faster than anyone thought possible. He had been given the army of Italy in 1796, a force so poorly supplied that when he arrived and looked at it, he told the men outright that the government owed them everything and could give them nothing, and that he intended to lead them somewhere they could take it for themselves. Then he did. He beat the Austrians repeatedly, took northern Italy, sent enormous quantities of money and art back to Paris, and, this is the part the Directory could not forgive, ran the conquered territory like it belonged to him. He appointed people, he made policy, he signed a treaty with Austria on his own initiative and presented it to his government as a fact. He came home in December 1797 to crowds in the street, and 5 nervous men who now had to work out what to do with him. He gave them an opening himself. He was put in charge of planning an invasion of England, the obvious next war, went to look at the northern coast, studied the Channel, studied the British fleet, and came back and told them plainly it could not be done. Not yet. The Royal Navy was too strong, and everybody in that room knew it, which left the question of what to do with the most dangerous man in France standing in Paris, unemployed. And somebody said, Egypt. The strategic argument for it was real, and it went like this. Britain could not be beaten at home. But Britain's wealth ran through India, and the shortest route between Britain and India ran across Egypt. Take Egypt, and you put a French army astride the road to the richest possession Britain had. You threaten India without ever crossing the Channel. Egypt was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice it was run by a warrior class called the Mamluks, originally an enslaved soldier caste from the Caucasus and Central Asia, who had over centuries become the ruling military elite of Egypt, and who by 1798 governed it more or less independently of Constantinople. The Directory's assessment was that the Mamluks were formidable individually and hopelessly outdated as an army. That assessment turned out to be correct, and it would matter less than anyone expected. So the strategic case existed. It was not a fiction. But read the decision alongside the politics, and it is very hard to miss the second thing happening. If the campaign succeeded, France gained an empire in the east, and the Directory could claim it. If it failed, the most dangerous man in the country was stranded on the wrong side of a sea patrolled by the Royal Navy, and the problem solved itself. He took the job. And the question people have asked ever since is whether he took it because he believed in it, or because he had already worked out that there was nothing left for him in Paris that summer. And a man who wanted to rule France would need something enormous to come back with. He was 28. He had already read everything about Alexander the Great that a man could read. And Alexander had gone east. Toulon, May 1798. And something is happening in that harbour that nobody in Europe can explain. Ships are gathering, not a squadron, an armada. By the time it sails, there are around 400 vessels of every description in and around that port, and 30-odd thousand soldiers being loaded onto them. And nobody will say where they are going. Not the captains, not the colonels, not the men. The destination is held by Bonaparte and a small circle around him, and the secrecy is close to absolute, because the entire operation depends on one thing. The British must not find out. British intelligence went slightly frantic. A French army was massing at a Mediterranean port and could be going to Portugal or Ireland or Naples or Sicily or straight through Gibraltar to England. The Royal Navy sent Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson to find out, and Nelson spent the next 2 months chasing a fleet across the Mediterranean and missing it, sometimes by days, once by hours. Meanwhile, the men on those ships were being loaded with things that made no sense, because the strangest cargo in that fleet was not the cannon, and it was not the 1,200 horses, and it was not, although this is true and I like it far too much, the several thousand bottles of wine that Bonaparte insisted on bringing. It was the people, 167 scholars, mathematicians, chemists, astronomers, engineers, naturalists, geologists, surveyors, cartographers, architects, doctors, artists, printers, with the first Arabic script printing press ever brought into Egypt. Men who had spent their lives measuring, drawing, classifying and recording, being loaded onto warships alongside grenadiers. Some of them were the most distinguished men in France. Gaspard Monge, one of the great mathematicians of the age, 53 years old and about to spend a year in a desert. Claude Louis Berthollet, a chemist whose work is still in the syllabus. Dominique Vivant-Denon, an artist and engraver in his 50s, who would end up sketching temples while under fire and would come home to become the founding director of the Louvre. Most of them had no idea where they were going either. Several of the younger ones later wrote that they had been recruited with a vague promise of a great scientific expedition and had assumed they were going somewhere in the west. Some found out where they actually were when they saw the coastline. Nobody had ever put an army and a research institute on the same ships before. Nobody has really done it since. And that decision, which looks at first like vanity, or theatre, or a young general's enthusiasm, is the single reason anybody outside a lecture hall still talks about this campaign at all. On the 19th of May, the fleet sailed. On the way it stopped at Malta, which had been held for 260 years by the Knights of St. John, and took it in about a day and a half. Bonaparte spent 6 days there reorganising the government of an island he had captured almost in passing, then left a garrison and moved on. And then, on the 1st of July, the coast of Egypt came up out of the haze. They had crossed a sea patrolled by the most powerful navy on earth, with 400 ships, and Nelson had missed them. That is the good luck. Remember how it feels, because it lasts exactly 1 month. Get onto one of those ships for a moment, because 6 weeks of it is a strange experience and the accounts are wonderful. An 18th century transport carrying soldiers is dark, crowded and violently uncomfortable. The men are below decks in hammocks slung close enough to touch. It is hot. The water goes stale within days and then gets worse. Seasickness moves through a regiment of infantrymen who have mostly never been on a boat, and there's nowhere to go. Bonaparte himself was a poor sailor, and spent a good deal of the voyage ill in his cabin on Lorient, which is a detail I find genuinely humanizing about a man who is otherwise very difficult to picture as an ordinary person. But when he was up, he did something that tells you a great deal about what kind of expedition this was. He held debates. Most evenings on the flagship in the great cabin, he assembled the scholars and the senior officers and put a question on the table, and then argued about it. Is there life on other planets? What is the age of the Earth? Does a nation need a religion in order to function? Can dreams be interpreted? Naval officers and generals and mathematicians and chemists at sea, on the way to a war none of them could name the destination of, arguing about the age of the world. Monge and Berthollet did most of the intellectual heavy lifting. Bonaparte apparently enjoyed taking whichever side of a question created the better fight, and several people who were there record that he was extremely good at it and completely unembarrassed about being wrong. That is not a detail I would include if it were only charming. It matters because it tells you the scholars were not decoration. They were in the room, at the centre, every night before a shot was fired. Then, on the 9th of June, the fleet arrived at Malta. Malta had been ruled for 268 years by the Knights of St. John, a crusading military order that had become, by 1798, an ageing institution running a fortified island with an enormous harbour, sitting exactly where a French fleet on its way east would want to stop. Bonaparte requested permission to enter the harbour and take on water. The knights replied that under their neutrality they could admit only a small number of ships at a time. He took that as his answer and landed troops. The whole thing was over in about a day and a half. The Knights Order had been in decline for decades. A substantial number of its members were themselves French and disinclined to fight their own countrymen, and the fortifications, which were genuinely formidable, were manned by a garrison with no real appetite for the fight. And then, in 6 days on that island, Bonaparte did something that shows you exactly how his mind worked when he was not fighting. He abolished the order's rule. He set up a governing commission, reorganized the administration, established a system of public schools, reformed the hospitals, and issued a decree freeing the enslaved people held on the island, of whom there were several thousand. Many of them Muslim captives taken at sea over generations. 6 days. Then he left a garrison of 4,000 men, loaded the treasury of the order onto his flagship, and sailed east. That treasure went down with Lorient at Aboukir 7 weeks later, and it is still down there. Trouble starts with the harbour, and it starts immediately. They arrive off Alexandria, and the water is bad for a fleet that size, shallow in the wrong places, poor holding ground, exposed, and there is a report that British ships were seen off this coast only days ago. Bonaparte makes a decision that cost lives immediately. He will not wait for good conditions. The army goes ashore that night, in a rising sea, in small boats, in the dark. Men drown in the surf before a shot is fired. By dawn, there are several thousand French soldiers standing on a beach in Egypt in wet uniforms, and Alexandria is in front of them. And Alexandria is not what any of them expected. They have all read the same books. Alexandria in their heads is the city of the Ptolemies, the lighthouse that was one of the wonders of the world, the greatest library in antiquity, a metropolis of 500,000 people, the intellectual centre of the Mediterranean. What is actually in front of them in 1798 is a town of perhaps 8 or 10,000 people living among the wreckage of all of that. The lighthouse is long gone. The library is a memory. Ancient columns are built into ordinary walls. Broken statuary lies in the sand at the edge of town, half buried, unremarked. It is the first of a great many moments in this campaign where French soldiers walk into a name they have known since school and find the real place, and are quietly wrecked by the difference. They take the town that morning. It does not take long. And then Bonaparte turns his army inland toward Cairo, and the campaign properly begins, and the desert nearly ends it inside a week. Here is what an army in 1798 wears. Thick wool coats, buttoned high, heavy packs, leather crossbelts, and a shako or a bicorn on the head that provides no shade worth the name, because all of it was designed for campaigning in Germany and northern Italy, and every single item of it was issued before anybody in the supply chain knew this army was going to Africa. It is July. In the Nile Delta and the desert margin between Alexandria and Cairo, they march by day. The water discipline collapses almost immediately, because the men have not been in a climate like this and do not know what it does to you. Wells along the route have in some cases been filled in ahead of them. The maps are poor, the guides are few, and the distances between water are longer than the officers planning it believed. Soldiers' accounts of that march are some of the bleakest writing in the whole campaign, and none of it is about combat. It is about thirst and mirage and men lying down at the side of a track and not getting up, and the constant grinding presence of an enemy the French cannot catch. Because the Mamluk cavalry are shadowing them the entire way. They do not fight a set battle. They do not need to. They ride down stragglers, cut off water parties, appear on the flank of a column, and vanish before the French can form up. The French infantry can beat them in a formed engagement, and both sides know it, so the Mamluks simply decline to give them one. Morale drops through the floor. There are officers, senior ones, openly saying the campaign is a mistake within 2 weeks of landing, there are men who simply stop. And then, after almost 3 weeks of that, on the 21st of July, the army comes out of the desert near a village called Mbabe on the west bank of the Nile, and on the other side of the river is Cairo. And between the French army and the city, drawn up and waiting, is the Mamluk cavalry. Thousands of them, in the finest armour and the richest clothing any of these exhausted, filthy, sunburnt Frenchmen have ever seen in their lives, on the best horses in the world. There is a phrase everybody knows from this day, and it comes from here. Before the fighting starts, Bonaparte gathers his officers and points south, toward 3 shapes standing on the horizon in the haze, and says, "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you." It is a magnificent line, and it did the job it was designed to do, and it has been in every account of this campaign ever since. The detail that almost always gets left out is that the pyramids were roughly 15 kilometres away. They were visible, barely, small on the horizon in the heat shimmer. The paintings you have seen of this battle, with the pyramids looming enormous behind the fighting, are painted in Paris by artists who were not there and who understood correctly that this was a better picture than the truth. The battle itself was not close. The French formed into massive infantry squares, hollow rectangles bristling with bayonets on every face, with artillery at the corners and the officers and baggage inside. It is an old formation, and it exists for one purpose, which is to make cavalry irrelevant, because a horse will not charge into a solid wall of points, and a rider cannot get around a shape with no rear. The Mamluks charged anyway, because the Mamluk military tradition was built on individual excellence, personal courage, and the shock of heavy cavalry. And against almost every enemy they had faced for centuries that had worked. They rode round and round those squares looking for a gap, and the squares held, and the artillery fired into the mass at close range, and it was over in a couple of hours. Egyptian and French accounts agree that Mamluk casualties were severe and French casualties were light. And here is the part that tells you what this defeat actually was. The Mamluk cavalry rode into that battle wearing their wealth. That was the custom. A Mamluk warrior carried his fortune on his body and on his horse. Gold, jewels, weapons with gold-inlaid hilts, coins sewn into clothing. For weeks after that battle, French soldiers were fishing bodies and equipment out of the Nile and finding money on them. Individual privates in that army, men who had been paid almost nothing for years, walked away from Mbabe with more coin than they had ever held. Cairo surrendered without a fight 2 days later. Bonaparte had beaten the ruling military class of Egypt in under 3 hours, taken the capital in under a week, and secured the country. 11 days after that, his entire strategic position was destroyed in a single night by a man who had spent 2 months looking for him and had almost given up. Cairo in 1798 was one of the largest cities in the world outside China, with something in the region of 250,000 people, and the French were not prepared for it in either direction. They were not prepared for how large and sophisticated it was, and they were not prepared for how little it resembled the fantasy they had brought with them. They arrived expecting the Orient of the books they had read, which is to say, a place assembled out of translated stories and paintings by men who had never been there. What they found was a working city, enormous, dense, crowded, entirely coherent on its own terms, and utterly indifferent to them. The city had covered markets running for streets at a time. It had mosques that had been standing for 800 years. It had a water system that brought the Nile inland by aqueduct, and then distributed it through the streets by an entire profession of water carriers with skins on their backs. It had public bathhouses with a social life built around them, coffee houses everywhere, and an economy of specialized crafts organized by guild. And it had Al-Azhar, a mosque and teaching institution founded in the 10th century, which had been a center of Islamic scholarship for 800 years and drew students from across the Muslim world. Law, theology, grammar, logic, astronomy, medicine. The French had arrived, in their own telling, to bring enlightenment to Egypt and pitched their tents next to a university older than anything in France. Some of the savants work this out very quickly, and their notebooks change tone as they do. Now the men the French had just beaten. The Mamluks are one of the most extraordinary institutions in history, and almost nobody in the English-speaking world can tell you what they were. They began as an answer to a political problem. How do you build an army that will not be pulled apart by family loyalty, tribal alliance, or dynastic politics? The answer, developed over centuries in the Islamic world, was to buy boys, usually from the Caucasus, the Black Sea regions, the Turkic steppe. Bring them into the household of a ruler, convert them, educate them, and train them from childhood as elite cavalry, entirely dependent on the household that raised them. A Mamluk was, technically, of enslaved origin, and he was also part of the ruling military caste, and both of those were true simultaneously. The system worked well enough that in 1250, the Mamluks in Egypt simply took the country and ran it themselves. They then produced over the following centuries one of the most powerful states in the Mediterranean world, and in 1260 they stopped a Mongol army at Ain Jalut, which is one of the very few times in that century that anybody did. Even after the Ottomans took Egypt in 1517, the Mamluks remained. They reconstituted themselves under Ottoman sovereignty, and by the 18th century they were the actual power in the country, with the Ottoman governor a formality, and a Mamluk household politics of alliance, feud and succession running underneath. And the men who charged those French squares at Ember Bay were the product of that whole system. A Mamluk was a superb individual horseman. He was trained from childhood in the saddle. He carried multiple weapons, sabre, lance, javelins, and often several pistols and a carbine, and could use all of them at speed. French officers who fought them, including Bonaparte, wrote about their courage and their horsemanship with unmistakable respect. There is a much-quoted assessment from that period holding that in small numbers a Mamluk was more than a match for a French cavalryman, and that in large numbers the result reversed completely. That is the whole tragedy of that battle in one sentence. It was not a fight between brave men and cowards, or between a modern people and a backward one. It was a collision between a military culture built on individual excellence and one built on massed, drilled, coordinated formations, and the second one wins that particular argument almost every time. The Mamluks were not destroyed at Ember Bay. Substantial forces under Murad Bey escaped south into Upper Egypt and kept fighting for years, and chasing them is what took Denon and his sketchbook up the Nile past Thebes and Karnak. Which means, in one of the neater ironies of the whole story, that the surviving record of pharaonic Egypt exists partly because a Mamluk commander refused to surrender and kept a French column marching south for months. The French fleet had not stayed at Alexandria. The harbour was wrong for the big ships, so Admiral Brueys, commanding the naval side of the expedition, moved the battle fleet about 20 kilometres east and anchored it in Aboukir Bay, in a line close to the shore. The reasoning was sound on paper. Anchored in a line close in with shoal water on the landward side, the fleet was effectively a floating fortress. An attacker could only come at it from one direction. The French ships even had their heaviest guns run out on the seaward side, because that was the only side anybody expected to be attacked from. On the 1st of August, in the late afternoon, Nelson found them. He had been hunting this fleet across the entire Mediterranean for 2 months. He had sailed to Egypt once already, arrived before the French, found nothing, and left. He was, by his own correspondence, half out of his mind with frustration. And when he finally saw those masts in Abuka Bay, he did not wait for morning. That is the whole battle, right there in that decision. Attacking a fortified enemy fleet in unfamiliar coastal water with shoals nobody had charted, in the dark, was the kind of thing captains were taught not to do. He went straight in, and then his captains did the thing that decided it. If the French ships were anchored with enough water between them and the shore for a ship to pass, then the French had left an entire side undefended. One British squadron went round the head of the French line and down the inside between the French fleet and the shoreline, while the rest engaged from the sea. The French were caught between 2 lines of fire on the side they had not prepared, with half their guns still stowed and a significant number of their crews ashore digging wells. The fighting went on into the night, and at around 10 in the evening the French flagship, L'Orient, one of the largest warships afloat, carrying the expedition's treasury, caught fire, and the fire reached her magazine. The explosion was heard by multiple accounts, many kilometres away in Alexandria. Both fleets stopped firing. There is a British gunner's account describing a pause of several minutes in which nobody on either side did anything at all, just the sound of debris coming back down into the water. Then the battle restarted. By morning, the French Mediterranean fleet had effectively ceased to exist, most of it destroyed or captured. Admiral Brueys dead, 2 ships escaped, and a French army of some 35,000 men was standing in Egypt, 3,000 kilometres from home, with no fleet, no supply line, no reinforcement, and no way out. Bonaparte received the news in Cairo. The accounts of his reaction differ in tone but agree on substance. He absorbed it, and then almost immediately began behaving as though it had always been the plan, because there was now exactly one option available to him, and he took it. If you cannot leave a country, you had better start running it. And this is where the campaign turns into something nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted. In August 1798, with his fleet on the bottom of Abuka Bay and his army stranded, Bonaparte founded a scientific academy in Cairo, the Institut d'Egypte, modelled directly on the Institut de France, housed in a requisitioned palace in a garden district of the city. Regular sessions, minutes taken, papers presented and debated, a printing press producing documents in French and Arabic, Monge as its first president, Bonaparte himself as vice president, which tells you something about how he wanted to be seen. And the scholars, who had been recruited into a mystery, shipped across a sea, marched through a desert and were now marooned, went to work with an energy that is genuinely difficult to explain unless you accept that most of them were simply thrilled to be there. The brief was effectively everything. Survey the country, map it, measure the Nile and its flood, study the crops and the irrigation, catalogue the animals, the birds, the fish, the insects, record the trades, how glass is blown here, how bread is baked, how a water wheel is built, how cloth is dyed, document the architecture, study medicine and disease, record music, instruments, clothing, tools, and go and look at the monuments. Because the monuments had never been properly recorded. Europeans had been visiting Egypt for centuries and had produced travellers' accounts sketches of variable quality, and a great deal of nonsense. What had never happened was a systematic survey by trained draftsmen and engineers with instruments, working to scale over years. That is what the savants did, and the conditions they did it under are the part that never makes it into the summary. Vivant Denon attached himself to a military column heading south into Upper Egypt, chasing the Mamluks who had escaped the battle. He was in his 50s. He spent months moving through a war zone with a sketchbook, drawing. There is an account of him at Dendera, arriving with the column at first light, seeing the temple and the soldiers, who'd been marching all night, spontaneously stopping and applauding, not on an order, because of what was in front of them. Denon drew everywhere. He drew at Thebes, Karnak, Luxor, Esna, Edfu, Phili. He drew while the column was moving and would run back to finish a sketch. He drew resting his paper on his knee, on a saddle, on a stone. He drew in heat that cracked his equipment, and what he came back with was the first accurate visual record of pharaonic Egypt ever produced. Meanwhile, other teams were measuring, mapping, surveying the isthmus at Suez, where they found and traced the remains of an ancient canal that had once connected the Nile to the Red Sea thousands of years earlier. That survey, and the idea behind it, would run directly into the 19th century and the building of the Suez Canal. All of this by men who could not go home, and in July 1799 in the Delta, one of them found something in a wall. Get specific about the work, because they studied Egypt is the kind of sentence that lets you skip past the strangest year in any of these men's lives. Picture the column moving south along the Nile in pursuit of Murad Bey. Infantry, artillery, camels, and somewhere in the middle of it, a group of civilians in their 40s and 50s, most of them physically unsuited to any of this, carrying instruments and paper. They are being shot at, not constantly but genuinely. Denon's own account has him sketching while skirmishing goes on, and finishing drawings after the column has already started moving again. And they keep working. At Thebes, the column came round a bend in the river, and the ruins opened up on both banks, and the entire force stopped. Denon describes soldiers standing in their ranks and applauding, and it is not the only account of it. These were conscripts and veterans from farm villages in France, and they stood in the sun and clapped at a temple. The savants measured. That is the thing that separates this from every previous European visit to Egypt. Not sketched impressions, measured to scale with instruments by trained engineers who had built roads and fortifications. They measured the Great Pyramid and got extremely close to the correct dimensions. They surveyed the temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor. They recorded the zodiac ceiling at Dendera in detail, which set off a furious argument back in Europe about the age of the Earth, because if the astronomical arrangement carved into that ceiling was a literal record of a sky, some people were prepared to argue it was older than the date the Bible was then commonly held to allow. That fight went on for decades and involved some of the best minds in Europe, and it started with a drawing made by tired men in a war zone. They surveyed the Nile itself, its levels, its flood, its channels, and produced hydrological data of real quality. They went to Suez and traced the line of an ancient canal that had once run between the Nile and the Red Sea. Their surveyor got the relative sea levels wrong, which delayed the idea of a modern canal for decades until the error was corrected. But the survey and the idea both come from this expedition. They collected plants, minerals, animals, fish out of the Nile, insects, birds. Some species were described scientifically for the first time from specimens taken on this campaign. They recorded the living country as carefully as the ancient one, and this is the part that gets overlooked. There are plates in the final publication showing how a potter throws a pot in 1799, how a loom is strung, how a water wheel is geared, how a boat is built, what tools a carpenter owns, what a market stall holds, what instruments a musician plays. Not because it was glamorous, because a group of men who'd been trained to record things systematically had been handed a country and told to record it, and they did not stop. And in among all of it, an engineering officer taking apart a wall stumbled onto the one object that would make it all legible again. The story is almost too neat, and it is true. A French officer of engineers named Pierre-François Bouchard was supervising work on the fortifications of a fort near the town of Rashid, which Europeans called Rosetta, on the western branch of the Nile. They were demolishing an old wall to strengthen the defences. In the rubble of that wall was a slab of dark stone, roughly a metre high, broken, with writing carved into one face. Bouchard was not an archaeologist. He was a soldier doing engineering work in a war. But he had come to Egypt as part of an expedition where every officer had been told, repeatedly, that anything ancient mattered. And he looked at that stone and saw immediately that there were 3 different scripts on it. 3 scripts. 1 slab. At the top, hieroglyphs. The sacred script of ancient Egypt, which no living human being on earth could read. The last person who could had died more than 1,000 years earlier. The knowledge was simply gone. In the middle, a second Egyptian script, more cursive, also unreadable. And at the bottom, Greek, ancient Greek, which any educated European in that army could read as easily as a newspaper. Bouchard understood what he might be holding within minutes, and reported it up the chain immediately. The stone went to Cairo, to the institute, where scholars produced careful copies and ink impressions of the inscription, and sent them back to Europe. The Greek section turned out to be a decree issued by priests in 196 BC, in the reign of Ptolemy V. Routine administrative and religious business, entirely unremarkable in content, and utterly transformative in form, because if the same text was written 3 times, in 3 scripts, then the Greek was a key. It still took more than 20 years. It took the work of the English polymath Thomas Young, and then the decisive breakthrough by the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in 1822, who had spent his life preparing for exactly this, and who understood, crucially, that Coptic, still used liturgically by Egyptian Christians, was a direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian language. But it happened. In 1822, a human being read hieroglyphs again for the first time in 14 centuries, and everything followed from that. Every temple inscription, every tomb wall, every papyrus, every king list. 3,000 years of writing that had been decorative and mute suddenly became documents. The entire discipline of Egyptology exists downstream of that moment. The stone itself never made it to Paris. When the French position in Egypt finally collapsed in 1801, the surrender terms handed over the antiquities the expedition had collected to the British. The French scholars protested furiously, and by several accounts came close to destroying their own collections rather than surrender them. They lost the argument. The Rosetta Stone went to London, where it has been in the British Museum ever since, and where the question of whether it should still be is a live argument today. But the copies had already gone out. That is the detail that matters. The impressions taken in Cairo had been distributed to scholars across Europe before the stone ever left Egypt, which is why a French officer digging out a wall on the Nile Delta on a doomed expedition in a war his side was going to lose is the reason you can read the name of a pharaoh today. Something happens to a stranded army that nobody plans for, and it is worth watching, because the French spent 3 years in Egypt and only a fraction of that was fighting. They built a small France inside Cairo, and it was extremely strange. There was a theatre, actual stage productions put on by soldiers, for soldiers. There were reading rooms. There were 2 newspapers printed in Egypt on the expedition's presses, one official, one more general, which are the first newspapers ever printed in the country. There were gardens laid out. There were windmills built on the hills outside the city, which the population found genuinely odd. There was a rudimentary postal system, a system of street lighting introduced in parts of Cairo, and a serious attempt at a census. The engineers built a chemical works because the army needed gunpowder, and there was no supply coming from France ever again. Berthollet, one of the great chemists in Europe, ended up personally sorting out the manufacture of saltpeter in Egypt because it was that, or the army ran out of ammunition. They set up a hospital system. They studied ophthalmia, which was blinding their own soldiers in large numbers, and produced serious clinical work on it. And then there was the balloon. Somebody had brought a hot air balloon and the equipment to fly it, because in the 1790s France was the world leader in ballooning, and it was regarded as a marvel of the age. In December 1798 they staged a public ascent in Cairo. Enormous crowds, official ceremony, the works. The balloon went up and caught fire and came down. Al-Jabarti's account of it is one of the funniest passages in his entire chronicle, and it is funny because it is so dry. He describes the French claim about what the device could do, describes what it actually did, and concludes that it turned out to be like the kites that servants make at festival time. That single sentence probably did more damage to French prestige in Cairo than the balloon was ever going to repair. And underneath the theatres and the newspapers and the balloons was a garrison of homesick young men who had worked out that they were not going home. The letters they wrote are the part of this campaign that stays with you longest. Thousands of them were sent, and a very large number were intercepted at sea by the British, who read them and then published a selection, because letters from a demoralized army are an excellent weapon. Which is why we can read them now. Soldiers describing the heat and the food and the plague, and asking after people at home, and saying plainly that they did not understand why they were in Egypt and would like to leave. The British printed private letters home to humiliate an enemy, and in doing so preserved the interior life of an entire army. Now step outside the French camp for a minute, because so far you've been hearing this the way the French heard it, and there was a whole country underneath it. Egypt in 1798 had roughly 3.5 to 4 million people. It had been under Ottoman sovereignty since 1517, and under effective Mamluk control for most of that time. It had cities with a scholarly tradition older than any university in France. Al-Azhar in Cairo had been teaching for 800 years. And into this arrived a European army announcing that it had come to liberate the Egyptian people from their oppressors. Bonaparte's proclamations on landing were carefully written and printed in Arabic on the press he had brought. They declared respect for Islam. They declared that the French were not enemies of the faith. They positioned the invasion as a war against the Mamluks specifically, and framed the French as friends of the Ottoman Sultan. Almost nobody believed it. We know this in unusual detail because Egypt in 1798 had a first-rate historian living in Cairo and watching the whole thing happen. Abd al-Rahman al-Jabarti was a scholar at Al-Azhar in his 40s when the French arrived, and he kept a detailed chronicle of the occupation. It is one of the most valuable sources anybody has from this occupation, precisely because it is the invasion seen from inside the city by an educated witness with no reason to flatter either side. Al-Jabarti is not a simple source, and that is exactly what makes him worth reading. He is scathing about the French proclamation. He goes through its Arabic line by line, criticizing the grammar and the theology and the sheer presumption of it, and the contempt comes off the page. He is also, elsewhere, genuinely impressed. He visited the institute. He describes the library, the instruments, the laboratories, and the fact that French scholars were willing to show him things and explain them. He describes a chemistry demonstration in detail. He writes about their books with real admiration. Both of those things are in the same chronicle, by the same man, about the same people. The occupation was not accepted. In October 1798, less than 4 months after the French took Cairo, the city rose against them. The revolt was serious. It centred on the Al-Azhar quarter, and it was put down hard, including with artillery fired into the city. Al-Jabati's account of what French troops did inside the mosque afterwards is bitter and specific, and it did more damage to the French position in Egypt than any battle. Whatever else the proclamations had said, after October 1798 nobody in Cairo was confused about what this was, and the campaign never recovered politically from that fortnight. There was a further problem that no proclamation could solve, and it was the thing that eventually ground the whole expedition down. Plague. Bubonic plague was endemic in the eastern Mediterranean, and the French had no defence against it whatsoever. It moved through the army in waves. It killed more French soldiers over the course of the occupation than every battle of the campaign put together, and it kept doing it after Bonaparte had gone. An army with no fleet, no reinforcements, an increasingly hostile population, and a disease it could not stop. That is the situation in the spring of 1799 when Bonaparte decides to march north. The reasoning was defensive, and it was not stupid. The Ottoman Empire had by now declared war on France. The fiction that this was somehow a friendly operation against the Mamluks on the Sultan's behalf had collapsed. An Ottoman army was being assembled in Syria to march south into Egypt. Bonaparte's answer was to go and meet it first, with around 13,000 men up the coast into Ottoman Syria, through what is now Gaza and Israel and Lebanon, to break the invasion before it started. The first towns fell, and then the column reached Acre. Acre was a coastal fortress on a promontory, held by an Ottoman governor named Jeza Pasha, and it had two things Bonaparte had not counted on. The first was the Royal Navy. Sir Sidney Smith, commanding a small British squadron off the coast, did two things that decided the campaign. He intercepted the French siege artillery, which was being shipped up the coast by sea because it was too heavy to drag overland, and captured it. And then he anchored his ships where their guns could support the walls. So the French arrived at a fortress they intended to smash open, without the guns they had brought to smash it. The second thing was a French engineer. There was a man inside Acre advising the defence named Louis-Edmond de Philippot, a royalist émigré, an officer of engineers, and a former classmate of Bonaparte's from military school in Paris. He had trained in the same rooms, on the same principles, and he understood exactly how a French siege would be conducted, because he had been taught to conduct one. He rebuilt the defences of Acre specifically against the man outside it. The siege ran for 2 months. The French attacked repeatedly and could not get in. Plague was in their camp. The Ottoman garrison was resupplied by sea whenever it needed to be, because the sea belonged to the British. In May 1799, Bonaparte gave the order to withdraw, and the army walked back to Egypt, and that retreat down the coast in summer with sick men and no transport is one of the worst things in the campaign. He had lost. It was the first strategic defeat of his career, and he never fully accepted it. Years later, on St. Helena, he was still returning to Acre, still saying that if that one fortress had fallen, the entire East would have opened up and the world would have gone differently. He got back to Cairo in June 1799, and in July an Ottoman army landed by sea at Abukir, the same bay where the fleet had died, and he marched straight up and destroyed it in a single day, in a battle that was as sharp and as decisive as anything he ever did. So the position by August 1799 is this: he has won almost every battle he has personally fought in Egypt. He has lost the campaign anyway, because the sea belongs to somebody else. His army is intact, capable, and slowly dying of a disease he cannot fight. He is the effective ruler of a country that does not want him. And then a bundle of newspapers arrives. They come from Sidney Smith. The British Commodore off the coast sends French newspapers into Bonaparte, apparently as a courtesy, possibly as something considerably more calculated. They are months old. They are the first real news from France anybody in Egypt has had in a year. And what is in them is catastrophic. While the French army has been in Egypt, a new coalition has formed against France in Europe. Almost everything Bonaparte personally won in Italy has been lost. Austrian and Russian armies are in the field and doing well. The Directory is unpopular, fractured, and looks close to collapse. France itself is being spoken of as under threat. Sit with what that information does to the man reading it. Everything he built in Italy is gone. The government that sent him here is failing. The country is in crisis, and he is 3,000 kilometres away, on the wrong side of a British-controlled sea, in charge of an army that cannot leave. He makes his decision within days, and he tells almost nobody. 2 frigates had been sitting in Alexandria harbour for weeks. The Muron and the Carrère, quietly kept ready on standing orders. On the 22nd of August 1799, Bonaparte leaves Cairo, letting it be understood that he is making a tour of the Delta. He travels with a specific and revealing group, the generals Berthier, Murat, Lannes and Marmont, and the scholars Monge and Berthollet and Vivant Denon. Note who that is. Those are the men he will need in Paris. It is not an escape party. It is a transition team. He sends word to General Kleber, his second in command, and the man who's about to inherit all of this, asking to meet him at Rosetta. Kleber travels to Rosetta. Bonaparte is not there and was never going to be. By the time the message is understood, the frigates are gone. He goes aboard at night, off a beach near Alexandria, with the British squadron somewhere out in that darkness, doing exactly what it has been doing for a year, which is watching this coast. A proclamation is left behind to be read to the army after he has sailed. It says that he is returning to France, that circumstances require it, that Kleber now commands, and that he will send help. The army takes it badly. Of course it does. Soldiers' letters and memoirs from that autumn are full of it. Men who had followed him through the desert, through Acre, through plague, finding out from a piece of paper that he'd gone home without them. And Kleber, handed a stranded army, a hostile country and an epidemic, wrote a furious report to the government in Paris, which the British intercepted at sea and published. That is how the phrase entered circulation across Europe. Kleber's own words, in his own hand, that Bonaparte had left the country for France without saying a word of his intention to any person whatsoever, and had arranged to meet him at Rosetta the following day. The British printed it and put it everywhere, and English caricaturists drew Bonaparte as the deserter of the army of Egypt, and the phrase stuck. The crossing took 41 days, hugging the North African coast, then up past Corsica, and in 41 days, on a sea controlled by the Royal Navy, carrying the most wanted man in Europe, those two frigates did not meet a single enemy warship. There's been speculation ever since about whether that was really luck. Some have suggested British commanders let him through deliberately, calculating that Bonaparte loose in France would destabilise the Republic more than Bonaparte stuck in Egypt. There is no solid evidence for it, and most historians treat it as coincidence. He landed in France on the 9th of October 1799. The country did not treat him as a deserter. The country treated him as a returning hero, because the country had been reading his own dispatches for a year and knew about the pyramids and the victories, and had not been told very much about Acre or the plague or the fleet at the bottom of Aboukir Bay. 38 days after he stepped off that ship, he overthrew the government of France. The Directory, the 5 men who had sent him to Egypt to get him out the way, ceased to exist in a single afternoon on the 9th of November 1799. Within a month he was first consul. Within 5 years he crowned himself emperor. He had left Paris in 1798 as a problem to be exported. He came back in 1799 and took the whole country in under 6 weeks. What happened when he landed is worth slowing down for, because it is the whole payoff of the gamble. He came ashore at Fréjus on the southern coast on the 9th of October 1799. By law, he should have been held in quarantine. A ship arriving from Egypt, where plague was known to be, was exactly what quarantine existed for. The crowd on the shore ignored it and carried him off the beach. That reaction repeated the entire way to Paris. Towns turned out, bells were rung, people stood along roads to watch a carriage go past. And the reason is worth understanding, because it is not simply that people liked him. For a year and a half, France had been reading about Egypt in dispatches that Bonaparte himself controlled. Newspapers had run the pyramids, the victories, the strange antiquities, the scholars. What had not been emphasized was the fleet on the bottom of Aboukir Bay, or Acre, or the plague, or the fact that the army was stranded. Meanwhile, the actual news from Europe had been relentlessly bad. The government was despised, and prices were terrible. So the general who had gone off to the east returned at precisely the moment when the country most wanted somebody to have been winning. The coup itself took 2 days, and very nearly failed. It was not primarily his plan. It was organised largely by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the directors and a serious political operator, who had concluded the constitution needed replacing and wanted a general to provide the force behind it. He had been shopping for one. Bonaparte was available, famous, and, Sieyès assumed, manageable. On the 9th and 10th of November, the legislative councils were moved out of Paris to Saint-Cloud on the pretext of a threat. The directors resigned or were pushed, and Bonaparte went to address the councils, and it went badly. He was not a natural public speaker in a hostile room. In the lower chamber he was shouted down, jostled, and a motion to outlaw him was raised, which would have ended it, and possibly him. What saved it was his brother Lucien, who happened to be president of that chamber, walking outside and telling the soldiers on guard that the deputies inside were being terrorized by armed men. The troops cleared the hall. By that evening the Directory did not exist, and there were 3 provisional consuls, and within weeks it was obvious which one of the 3 was actually running the country. 6 weeks. From stepping off a frigate at Fréjus to holding France. He was 30 years old. The army he left behind held on for 2 more years, and almost nobody tells this part. Kleber was, by most assessments, an extremely capable commander in an impossible position. He negotiated a withdrawal agreement with the Ottomans and the British that would have evacuated the army honourably, and then the British government refused to ratify it and demanded surrender instead. So Kleber turned round and fought. In March 1800, at Heliopolis, with a fraction of the numbers, he beat an Ottoman army several times the size of his own. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire period, and almost nobody has heard of it. 3 months later, he was assassinated in a garden in Cairo by a young Syrian student named Suleiman al-Halabi. Command passed to General Manu, who had converted to Islam and married an Egyptian woman, and who was not the soldier Kleber was. In 1801, a British army landed and the French position came apart. The army of Egypt surrendered in the summer of 1801 and was shipped home on British ships. Of the roughly 35 to 40,000 men who went out, a large proportion never came back, and most of those who died were killed by disease rather than by any enemy. The scholars came home too with their notebooks and their drawings and their crates, minus the antiquities, which went to London, and then they spent 20 years publishing. The Description de l'Égypte came out in volumes between 1809 and 1829. 23 volumes, around 900 engraved plates, some of them so large that a special piece of furniture had to be designed to hold the book. It is the most complete record of a country ever assembled by any expedition to that date. The monuments, the natural history, the crafts, the cities, the people, the plants, the fish, the instruments, the streets. And for Europe it landed like a bomb. Egyptian motifs turned up in furniture, architecture, jewellery, and interior design across the continent within a decade. Museums reorganised. Universities created chairs. The tourist industry that still exists today begins essentially here. An entire field of study and a century of European obsession came out of a military expedition that failed. So, the thing I left open at the beginning, why did he leave like that? Not why he left. The strategic case is fairly clear, and most historians accept it. France was in genuine crisis. The Egyptian expedition was militarily finished as a strategic project, and a general of his ability was worth more in Europe than in Cairo. On that reading, going home was correct. The argument is about how. He did not announce it. He did not address the army. He arranged to meet his second-in-command at a town and then sailed while that man was travelling there. He left a proclamation to be read after he was over the horizon, and he took with him the specific people he would need to take power at home. There are 3 ways to read it, and they are not fully separable. The first is that it was necessary secrecy. Tell an army you are leaving and the news is in every camp in Egypt by evening, and in British hands within days, and the entire crossing depends on nobody knowing which 2 ships to look for. On this reading, the deception was not aimed at Kleber. It was aimed at the Royal Navy, and Kleber was collateral. The second is that it was moral cowardice, and he knew it. He could not stand in front of those men and say it out loud, because there was no version of the sentence that sounded like anything other than what it was. Easier to write it down and be gone before it was read. The third is the coldest, and I think it is at least partly true. He was not primarily leaving Egypt. He was going to seize France. He had read the newspapers, understood the directory was finished, and worked out that whoever was standing in Paris at the right moment would take the country. That is a race, and in a race you do not announce your departure and spend 3 days on farewells. Every one of the men he brought with him had a role in what happened on the 9th of November. What makes it genuinely unresolvable is that all 3 can be true at once, and the man himself never gave a straight answer. He returned to Egypt in conversation constantly for the rest of his life. The campaign, Acre, the scholars, what might have been. He talked about it on St. Helena until the end. He never explained the beach. 2 things came out of these 3 years, and holding one does not require letting go of the other. The first is that this was an invasion. An army arrived uninvited in a country of 4 million people, fought a war there, occupied its capital, put down a rising in that capital with artillery, and stayed for 3 years. That the French printed proclamations about liberation does not change what it was, and Al-Jabati, who was standing in Cairo watching, did not need it explained to him. The second is that a group of stranded scholars, who could not go home, spent those same years measuring and drawing a country with a care nobody had applied to it before, and produced a record that gave the modern world back the ability to read ancient Egypt. Both of those happened. The second does not pay for the first, and pretending otherwise is how people end up telling this story badly. But leaving the second out would be its own kind of dishonesty, because it is the only reason the campaign is remembered at all. And the strangest part is the accident at the centre of it. Nothing in this expedition worked as intended. The fleet was destroyed within a month. The route to India was never taken. Acre held. The army was eventually shipped home by its enemies. Judged against every objective on the original plan, it is a total failure. And it produced the Rosetta Stone, the Institut d'Egypte, the description, the birth of Egyptology, the survey that pointed at the Suez Canal, and, indirectly, through a man who came home at exactly the right moment, the French Empire. The most consequential thing about that campaign is the thing nobody in that room in Paris was thinking about when they decided to get rid of him. There is a postscript I keep thinking about. The frigate that carried him home, the Muiron, Bonaparte never let go of. In 1807, at the height of his power, he wrote to his naval ministry ordering that she be preserved as a monument, and said he wanted her kept, if possible, for several hundred years. She was repaired and docked at Toulon with a gold inscription on her hull describing what she'd carried. After his fall, she was decommissioned. She was destroyed around 1850, in circumstances that are still not entirely clear. He also had a beautiful scale model of her made for his study, and that model survived everything. It is in a naval museum in Paris today. A small, perfect ship in a case, the only one of his monuments to that night that anybody kept. And in Aboukir Bay, the wrecks are still there. Underwater archaeologists have been surveying them since the 1980s. Lorient has been located and worked on. The debris field from that explosion is spread across the seabed, and divers have brought up coins, instruments, weapons and personal possessions belonging to men who went into the water on the 1st of August 1798. The ships that were supposed to carry an army home are still lying off that coast, a few metres down in the dark, where a British admiral found them at the end of a 2-month search. A few things in this one never get settled, and that's fine. Carry them loosely into sleep rather than trying to resolve them. Whether he ever privately admitted to himself what he had done to the men on that beach. Whether Sidney Smith, who sent in the newspapers that triggered the whole thing, understood what he was setting in motion, and whether he spent the next 16 years thinking about it. And whether any of those 167 scholars, packing instruments onto a warship in Toulon with no idea where they were going, could have imagined that their notebooks would outlast every single thing the army around them was sent to achieve. Nobody has answered those. Nobody is going to. A like is the only signal that tells me any of this is reaching anyone. One tap, nothing more. Subscribe if you want whatever comes next. I dig for whichever telling still stands up after you fact-check it, then I take my time with it. And since tonight was about a thing found in a wall by somebody who was not looking for it, tell me in the comments about the strangest thing ever dug up where you live. A coin, a bottle, a road under a road, and say which part of the world you're in and what hour it has reached there. Now let the harbour go quiet. Let 2 frigates sit at anchor with their sails still furled before anyone has decided anything. Let a 53-year-old mathematician win a race to the top of a pyramid and hand round the brandy. Let a man in his 50s sit down in the sand at Dendra with a sketchbook on his knee and start drawing something no European has ever drawn properly before. Sleep well. Somewhere in a museum tonight, in a case, under low light, there is a broken slab of dark stone with 3 kinds of writing on it. And because a soldier looked twice at a wall he'd been ordered to knock down, we can read every word.